Our 1 o'clock session is a conversation about issues of trust and consistency. And we're really fortunate to have with us today Christina Drummond, who's the program officer at what do we call it? eBook, the open access ebook analytics project that has been funded by the Mellon Foundation, led by Kevin Hawkins of the University of North Texas, with several co-PIs, including Christina's boss, Catherine Skinner, and me. We're actually going to talk more broadly about the issues of open and trusted infrastructure and scholarly communications. It's just something that Christina spends days, nights, and weekends thinking about. And I'd love to, you're currently working with Educopia on this project, but you are our program officer, so welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. It's really just exciting to be able to geek out and talk about these issues around data interoperability at the end of the day. So thanks for having me.
It's what we get to do for a living. Maybe you could start by talking about what trust means, or what the word trust means when it comes to talking about trusted infrastructure and scholarly communications. How do you think about it?
Well, I feel like I'm going to give you an answer straight out of the policy framework world, which is it depends. Trust really depends on the perspective of both kind of the role you're playing when you're interacting with data and the role you have within, if you think of it as a data ecosystem, kind of what your position is. And I'm a visual person, so I'm going to actually share a slide for those of you who prefer to look at information while folks are talking. But to illustrate this point, and hopefully you're all seeing kind of a slide that says trustworthy data stewardship, and as data stewarding institutions are expected to. The key thing here to understand, and this actually comes from the Open Data Institute, because they did a lot of research into, what does it mean for any of our institutions that work as data institutions to be trusted? And what they found is what that definition is differs if you're the one providing data. If you're providing data to an institution, the things that define trust really is, can we trust them to follow our rules and process this data and handle the data and steward that data in a way that's expected? Can we trust that by participating and engaging with this entity that our reputation won't be damaged, and that at the end of the day, we gain value out of that? And that's very different than when we think about trust in terms of those who would use the data. And I think that's usually the context most of us on this call would think of first, which is if we're engaging with a data institution because we want to use what's coming out of it, we want to use those data outputs. We want to trust that the data is fair, that we trust the provenance of the data. We want high quality data is perhaps the best way to put this, so that with that trust, we know we can take it and do things with it downstream and reuse the data. But we also need to trust that we are able to use it in a way that's allowable. And this is where licenses in terms of use and being transparent about all of that comes into play. I think there's a related piece of this here around the transparency of algorithms and algorithmic fairness to make sure that trust really hinges on being able to know what's happening to the data behind the scenes. And so I'll just flag that, but that's all, of course, in addition to what you see in this third column, which is, those who are impacted by the use of data. For them, trust looks even more different. And so if we think of scholarly communications, we need our scholars to trust that the data we have won't harm them at the end of the day and won't actually disparately impact some scholars over others. And so these questions around trust really do depend on where you sit.
That's a lot to be thinking about all at once. When you build something that actually is trustworthy, there's got to be some core infrastructure. How do you sustain it after it's actually built? I mean, how do you keep it vibrant, active, and responsive to the community?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up sustainability because to simplify what I was saying before, I think a lot of it comes back to being reliable, transparent, and sustainable. And that sustainability, again, it doesn't have a clear answer. And I think a lot of people are still trying to think through that, invest in open infrastructures, one of the efforts that many of us have probably engaged with on some point to think through this. But the key is to have, you know, connections and be collaborating with those parties that have a stake in this. And in some cases, that might be public infrastructure. In other cases, thinking through, you know, what does that mean for the distributed institutional models? Do we all have something that we need to be contributing? And it's challenging because there isn't a clear model for this yet. You know, is it based on membership or services? And I'll just flag something that we're working through in our project right now, which is questioning and really exploring the model of how do you generate funds to sustain these efforts, these data institutions long term. And when we're pulling data together, if we're acting as a data broker, if you will, there's this question of neutrality and independence. How do you make sure that you're treating that data in a way that is fair to everybody who's at the table, both the data providers and the data users? And if you are trying to think about that fairness piece, following that through, if we want to create data products, data analytics, data dashboards that may show rankings, for example, based on usage, does that treat everyone the same way? The way, you know, for those who've worked with numbers and metrics and data, the way you show a number, the context that you put that number in matters. And how you do that can support different business cases, which is all fine and needed. However, the question then becomes, can you support those use cases through a dashboard while also being a neutral broker so that people have trust in how that data is being handled? And I think defining neutrality is core to that piece about sustaining core infrastructure. We have to figure out what does it mean so that we can keep people at the table and engaged, and that people maintain that trust long term.
When you think about neutrality, is it a term that's also dependent on the stakeholders, on the audiences that you're serving?
Absolutely. And it depends in a couple of different ways. I think, you know, coming back to understanding what those motivations are and what the, you know, I would use the term use cases, how they want to use the data is key. But recognizing that the different stakeholders around the table very well may want to use that data in different ways. So the question becomes, well, what does that mean? You know, for us, I think a lot of it comes back to transparency. If we think of the data institutions and those of us who kind of act as data exchanges in the middle, if our job is to process data according to agreed upon standards in a transparent way and making available provenance of our data, how we're transforming data, how we're sharing it back out, that can increase some of the trust downstream. However, the being neutral means we have to do that the same way with all the parties, regardless of who those stakeholders are, to be able to generate that information so that people understand what we've done and why. And it's fairness in this case that really means that we're thinking about the consistency in processing and how we respond to what I said earlier about kind of doing no harm and making sure that we're not actually harming stakeholders by the ways that we're sharing the data back out.
And how do you build a multi-party system like the one that we're trying to do as you think about stakeholders? I mean, what steps do you need to take?
That's a great question, and something that we're doing in our project is, you know, starting with, many have heard, the principles of open scholarly institutions. And with policy in the background, you know, part of that is understanding who it is that is within your ecosystem. Who is it that's working with the data and has a stake in this one way or the other? And I'll pull up another visualization. I think some of you may have seen this because I know I shared this within the NISO community previously. But, you know, for us, we had to understand which different perspectives and really which different cultures were coming into play and what their metadata standards are. And so, you know, for our project, we're looking at open access books in particular, And this spans everything from those who are funding that content. So not only the publishers, but also the libraries and authors, perhaps, through distribution channels and the catalogs, the sales channels, all the way through to end user interfaces. Each one of those parties have a piece, we're looking at usage data. They have a role to play in the exchange of that data. And to address some of the issues that we have around data interoperability, both metadata and usage data, what we have to do is engage each of these types of stakeholders across the ecosystem. So coming back to your question of how, I would say that the first step is to understand your ecosystem and the different types of players within it, and then to really build those relationships, because these are system level conversations, and we have to think about working with networks of leaders to address some of the challenges that come up, some of the things that perhaps make our data not work well together. And so if we can identify who these stakeholders are, then we can start to move towards resolving issues of data quality upstream directly with the parties that are generating the data. And the good news is if we can do that, then we can reach economies of scale. We can actually reduce some of the duplication of effort around data normalization. I like to call it data wrangling, but how we have to curate the information so that we can then put it into a usable form.
And we've spent, just for context, we spent the morning talking about some use cases that are not related to open access and usage, but it's an example of how a data trust might be applied, which is to essentially say, here are the communities we're trying to serve. How do we back up? And I think you've employed, and you've been really rigorous within the project to make sure that we learn about either the similar or different needs of publishers, publishing platforms, and services, libraries, and universities. How did you go about that, and what did you learn?
Thanks, Brian. That's a great question. And actually, after this, I can share a link to a publication where we documented that. That's in collaborative librarianship. But the long story short is we were able to leverage design thinking principles, and through online communities, since we've done all this actually during the time of COVID. That's why I came on board right as everything shut down. But we were able to bring together online communities, peer-based communities. So librarians could talk to librarians, those who work in university presses and library publishers could talk to each other, our commercial publishers could talk to each other, and they could work through some of these questions of what is it that they want to do with the usage analytics? How did they want to apply it? And what that allowed us to do in those peer communities where they had that ability to talk with each other is it surfaced a number of needs that they had, both not only for reporting, but for analytics. And what we were then able to do as a project after going through that detailed process was to look across these communities to see where they had similar needs and use cases and where they had different needs that were just because of the nature of their role in scholarly communications. And I think the key to all of this, which again, inspired by design thinking, is going straight to those who will be working with the data to understand what they want to do, to get a sense of what those use cases are that could really be transformative. I'm sharing another slide for those who are in Zoom to just give them a sense of, this is a forthcoming publication. It should be out, hopefully within the next week or so. But at a high level, you'll see, for the large part, there are a lot of things that emerged from publishers and libraries that were shared. So thinking about open access programs, strategy, marketing strategy, editorial strategy, impact and usage reporting, these were common. But of course, we have libraries wanting to inform their collection development. That is something that's going to be unique to that audience. We have book publishing platforms and services that want to take usage data to actually improve their platforms and services. So understanding through those direct conversations what people wanted to do allows us to then think about what is it that we need at the data level and interoperability level to make this happen.
You've talked a couple of times in answering my earlier questions about the concerns you have over potential harm that might be caused, particularly by use or misuse of scholarly related data metrics. What role does a data trust have in kind of either resolving or fostering conversations around those potential harms?
That's a great question. And there's actually a few different ways to answer this. And I think the first thing to remember is to kind of go back and think about what those expectations are that emerge from the use cases. They can sometimes signal areas that may be the source of conflict or potentially could cause issues. So in our case, and I'll actually reshare that screen again for a moment because I think this is useful. We were talking both to the platforms and services that support the publishing industry as well as publishers themselves and libraries. And what we found were among the libraries and the publishers, they really wanted to have an understanding of how their investment in platforms, what did they get for that investment? And if they had certain collections that they were trying to target certain audiences with, what were the best dissemination platforms for those collections based on comparable titles, based on other activity. And so all of that is well and good. It helps them understand and get their book to their audiences more effectively. But the term more effectively is what this all hinges on, because if I were a platform and service and I had my members working with me today, and all of a sudden now they're comparing me to other platforms and services, I could potentially see members drop off because their collection could be better served by another service. So in that instance and in that scenario, does it potentially harm a platform if they're going to potentially lose members? And these are the types of dynamics that could, again, risk trust in a system if the other end data is being displayed or analytics are being provided that could potentially cost any of those data providers, customers, or services down the road. It makes it really hard, I think, to maintain that independence and neutrality in the middle if you're gaining revenue from these kinds of rankings at the back end. The other things I'll just note is, you have to steward data in line with ethical guidelines. So using scholars as an example, we don't really have ethical guidelines and principles right now for the use of scholar-specific data. And while over history, we've always had, our bylines to recognize the authors and the works together, with big data, we can now repurpose those kind of aggregate works of authors and build author profiles and scholar profiles that span not just here are the books that are published, but other data domains as well. And this is where it gets, is it technically possible? Yes. Is it something that's allowed given current privacy regulation? Possibly. It depends where you live. It depends if you're in Europe and if you're using personally identifiable information and fall under GDPR or the CCPA in California. But I think at the heart of all this, though, comes this question of what do we feel is right? What can we sleep with? And part of it takes kind of an increased imagination, if you will, of what could go wrong. I think data analytics is like any tool. We can use it, just like a hammer, we can use it for good, and it could also be weaponized. And so we have to think very carefully about potential harms so that we can put in place those policies and principles to say, here's what we expect as a community so that we can protect against those. And if we could put together guidelines for kind of the ethical use of these analytics, especially when they identify scholars, I think we'd be much farther along. But without such guidelines, it's really hard to put something into place that stewards data according to those guidelines. So I'll just note that, once you have these standards and in this communal agreement, efforts like data trust, like what we're doing, or international data spaces, some of you may have heard me discussing before we kicked off, all of these kind of data exchange federations, they require this kind of community rule book, community standards to be known. So because that's what they operationalize through their data governance mechanisms, be them contractual or technological or even compliance based.
And I think this isn't one of the questions that you and I talked about, but for preparation for today, but it is something we think about all the time. the principles-based approach, which is something that we're working on this summer, is a critical piece of the puzzle because we can't know all the consequences, intended or unintended, that might evolve. But if we can come to clear agreement on what the principles may be, which is our goal, then we have a framework to be able to resolve those conflicts when they arise down the road.
Yeah, and it's, you know, a lot of us in our communities, we're used to data management plans as an example of where we set out some of those kind of on a project basis or an infrastructure basis. And what we're looking at here when we're thinking about data exchange across parties, across organizations, is perhaps one step further, where it's not just a data management plan or even a data policy plan and data privacy plan, but taking that to cover, you know, what are the terms of use? What is it we expect from those who are sharing data out? And what is it that we expect in terms of how that data can be used for a specific purpose? There are some things that can't be shared CC0. And there are very good use cases as to why. And so you have to figure out, how do you create a rule book for all of the parties in your ecosystem that enable those use cases while also being sensitive to the protections or licensing that may be in place upstream on some of that data.
Yeah, it's part of what makes it fun. But also it is a challenge. I want to talk about the global nature of the project. You know, just for background, even in the research phase that we're in right now, we have participation from the US, Europe, South Africa, Australia, and the project team actually goes as far east or west, depending on how you look at it, as New Zealand. But the effort more broadly, the kind of the recommendations that we want to have come out of this is global in nature. And you spent a lot of time thinking about and learning about global data exchanges and the interplay with national policy frameworks. Maybe spend a few minutes telling us what you've learned over the course of not just the last year where you've been active in this project, but it's really a career interest of yours.
Thanks for that, Brian. You know, and I'll note to folks, I was just sharing with Jill before we started that I was lucky enough to spend the past 2 days learning more about what Horizons 2020 in Europe is putting forth and doing around international data spaces. So for those of you who are interested in learning more about what we're doing around data exchange, the idsa.org is a good kind of base for some more resources on that. But I'll just note, you know, I think Europe is really pushing pretty hard in terms of their funding and their regulatory approaches to what they want to do to really enable the data economy. And so, you know, what does that mean? I think here, especially in the US, we're very much in those early stages of the evolution to thinking about how linked data and usage data and the Internet of Things can be combined to, you know, for our purposes in this conversation today, thinking about, you know, national innovation policy making. How do we connect what we're seeing in scholarly communications with our national policy goals? And how does that connect to the activity that's taking place among our startups in the innovation space? What does that mean for collections development? So having data-driven decision-making accurately, you know, more closely aligned in being able to inform some of those decisions is something that I think we can get to. And just like privacy was 20 years ago, I actually started my career working on data brokers around personal information. And I can't believe that was 20 years ago when I worked at the ACLU in Washington State. But thinking about, you know, data brokerage and what does that mean for scalable data? Going from that to now, fast forward, here in the United States, we still don't have national policy, privacy policy. And, you know, what does that mean, especially when we have so many multinational efforts that have to interconnect with things like the GDPR in Europe? You know, given that international kind of inconsistency and playing field, you know, we know data policy here within the United States is a different type of regime than what we're seeing in Europe. And the European Union and the Commission is moving forward with their Data Governance Act and the Open Science Cloud investments. what does that mean for their ability to enable data-driven innovation? And does this become a national competitiveness angle that we need to be thinking through? I can't think of a clear equivalent here in the United States to what I was seeing this morning with Gaia X. For those who don't know, you can look, but that's kind of an initiative close to the international data spaces. Europe has kind of made a concentrated effort to really take this approach of fostering industry, inter-industry exchange of information in a couple core areas: mobility, healthcare, energy. And they're building these types of data spaces to make that happen across players. And they're funding it really well. I can't think of an equivalent here that's coming from the US side, but the key for all of us is many of these are multinational efforts, right? We think of scholarly communications, we could do that in any one nation. At the end of the day, it's still an international data exchange. And so, I expect, much like what we're seeing with privacy and how that's impacting work of many of us, even if we're not in Europe, we still have to think about GDPR because we're interacting with partners in Europe. I anticipate that the work that's going on with the Data Governance Act in the EU and the work that's going on in these international data spaces funded through the Commission, that's going to impact us as well. And so I think that we're going to see, hopefully, some movements in data policy and data regulation coming out of that kind of. But I also hope that we see some clear funding mechanisms to sustain and grow that kind of industry-specific metadata exchanges here domestically. And I will make one other note, and this is something that is just focused on inclusion. I think a lot of the work that I've seen being done is incredibly English-speaking country-centric, for lack of better terms. It's kind of the Anglophone world. And there's a lot of history about how we got here. But I think that one of the challenges we have is, how do we rethink our models of collaboration if we want to be global in nature? And what does that mean for our budget models to staff that up? I started international relations at Internet 2, research and education network side of things. But we actually had a staff to work directly with model. What's the equivalent of that we can have in this space around data exchange and data bridge? We could location networks. At the end of the day, I think federating national networks helps us for ability, while also data sovereignty, allows each nation to kind of bring their own needs forward in their own context. So it becomes more of an issue of interconnectivity and interoperability, as opposed to kind of one rule to rule them all.
Great. Christina, you've been breaking up a little bit. It may be on my side, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. But if you have a chance to just take a look at your connection, that'd be great. And while you're doing that, I wanted to just make the observation, one of the things that drew BISG into this project was actually the opportunity to think through issues of how do we create either a national or a global infrastructure. BISG's mission itself is national in focus, as is NISO's, but we operate in a world in which there's quite a bit of interplay with other international organizations. And we think about things like the standards that we apply, both in the U.S. perspective, but also representing the U.S. to other entities. That's a really big piece. Maybe to just close out, I wanted to ask you, Christina, what's next for the work that you're doing? I mean, this summer is kind of built on principles and on both the trust side as well as potentially dashboard side. Maybe talk a little bit about the continued work we're trying to do to kind of grow a consensus.
Will do. So we have gone through this use case development process to get a sense, and we're building on really this finding that all of the parties have kind of a common data curation function around usage data. And so what that's led us to do is think about, our project for it in two pieces. And it was actually informed by some legal analysis, especially given what's coming out of Europe, that we may need to pull apart the data analytics from that data exchange piece. And so over the course of really next 3 to 4 months, what we're doing with our, over 25 advisors from 5 continents, we're going to be trying to tease out what does that look like in terms of a mission and vision and an objective for both the exchange of usage data, but also any analytics that might ride on that as well. So thinking through a lot of the governance models with the hope that we can start to really build out what that rule book looks like and what might the kind of common terms be for those who want to participate in a global data exchange for open access ebook usage.
Yeah, it's going to be a busy summer, and the people can keep up to date. I'll put the Educopia link in the chat, so if people want to know more about it. But I think I promised you that the half hour would fly by, and it has. So I want to thank you for your time today, and also for giving us the background, not just on the project, but really on how you think about data trusts and the important rules and principles-based approach that you've kind of led for the last year on this project.
Thank you, Brian. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks.